I wonder if I could be quick about this, which I doubt. I'm thinking now of how a free market system is just as idealistic as, the most communist and socialist system, which everybody in America at least seems to understand is an ideal that, well, not everybody in America. Some people think that it's purely evil, but some decently intelligent people can understand that it's just an ideal that doesn't really work in practical use. This free market thing is what I'm thinking of right now because of all the different economic theories on what will spur our recession period. The conservative ideology suggests that government needs to remove its hands from the market so that the market operates freely. Under a free market, everything is wonderful and glorious, and everybody gets what they deserve because the market forces, known as supply and demand, and looking at profits versus expenditures, but essentially supply and demand is the biggest market force that's supposed to make everything wonderful for everybody. But that ideal ignores realities that always play upon that market in a way that results in something far less than free. Not unlike a communist or socialist ideal where everyone is sharing resources, but that particular idea seems like it's alright, everybody's going to have their apples and pears, everyone's going to have their bit of land, everybody's going to have their water. But what ends up happening is the reality is the people who control the allocation of those resources end up controlling the entire system. And thus communists and socialists end up becoming some really powerful totalitarian governments because it's usually the government's role to divvy out that resource allocation. Fucking airplane. Because it's usually governments that would divvy out the resource and handle the allocation to make sure everybody gets theirs. They're the ones that end up realizing, hey, we've got all the stuff. Do what we say or you ain't getting shit. So they become totalitarian-esque because you can't rely on anyone who controls all the resources to be fair. So a communist ideal is a flawed practical model because it puts too much resource control in the hands of the few. Now you see where I'm getting. A free market ideal where governments are hands off puts too much control of the resources in the few. It's just not the governments who control it. It would be the wealthy and the corporations. Corporations will try and dominate a free market system because it's just what they do. In a way, they're kind of inherently evil, but you don't necessarily have to see them that way, even though I've said that a million times that they're just evil. But I've been able to develop my thoughts on this. They're just doing what they do best, trying to survive and accrue power, and then they get kind of caught up in that and want to be the most powerful thing out there. And so they're going to stomp out competition. They're going to make alliances with other powerful groups, merge to become some super powerful group, and then control the market. That is why there needs to be a sort of regulation. The supply and demand idea says that if you got 1,012 apples out there, nobody's going to want to pay a lot of money for those apples because they're all over the place. So don't charge a lot of money for them. The producers of apples obviously happen to have a really excellent model, and their apples are falling off the trees, so it's not costing a lot to make them, and people don't have to pay a lot to get them. There's a lot of supply, so you can really charge like $1 for 3 pounds of apples. And everyone should be okay with that without having to steal. Whereas if for some reason trees dry up, apple supply goes down, and next thing you know, suppliers are finding that they're only producing less than 1/10 of the apples they used to, they're going to end up raising prices because apples are now scarce and producing them is hard, and they need to make profit off of that in order to keep their business alive. So now they're going to be $1 an apple. And people aren't going to be able to find apples anywhere anymore, so if they really want one, they're going to have to pay the $1. That is the market force of supply and demand keeping the apple prices in check. So a conservative idealist will say, when the government comes in and says, looky here, my hands are telling you that you're going to keep those apples at $1 a pound or else you're going to be taxed and sent to jail, then they're fucking it up because they're not allowing the supply and demand system to dictate the fairest price. Conservative idealists are partially right in that department. when the government puts its regulatory hands on that and says the price is fixed at this amount, or whatever they do, tax certain things that they do, so that it ends up affecting market supply and demand values, then they end up tampering with how the supply and demand system works. And that conservative purists really don't like. They paint the picture of the government being the thing that's controlling and fucking it all up and ruining it for everybody. And then they turn it into like what they call class warfare by saying, see, the wealthy are profiting off of high prices for things that you should be able to go out and pick. But the truth of the matter is, if they totally took their hands off the system, I'm not suggesting a solution that the government not tax anything or to always tax it or try and keep things in check. But complete removal of government forces on the market would result in some apple producers will be having more apples than others, and they'll say, oh, we'll just lower our prices and everybody will come to us and we'll make a big name for ourselves. And the next thing you know, they're burning down their enemies' apple farms so that they become the only apple producer out there. And then they team up with the other top 2 producers and they drive out every other apple manufacturer until they dominate the market. And then those individuals, those 3 apple farmers who came together and made one giant apple conglomerate, will dictate the price no matter what the supply is, thus resulting in a market far less than free than if it was government regulated. So, we have to pick our evil or our poison. And I suppose it's not appropriate to even think of things in these terms anymore. It's not really evil or poisonous, it's just what's most effective. What's most effective is to have some government regulation over not necessarily the price of apples, but how apple producers relate. They have to make sure that they maintain a certain kind of balance among apple producers, not destroying the ability for some to be very powerful, but definitely putting an end to the ability for some of them to control the market. That's supposed to be anti-monopoly laws and other things like that. And like everything else, the government can get carried away with this stuff too. But there needs to be, if we're going to choose between a purely free market where corporations can dominate and really be what is the social equivalent of dictators, or a completely controlled government regulated market where nothing is going to happen because government people will be bickering forever while the price of apples are too high and nobody can afford them, or producers are going out of work because they can't afford to make them. There has to be some sort of medium in between the two. And this is where political moderates come into play. What's that? A political moderate is somebody who can actually analyze a situation with just intelligence and facts and data without the insensitive and incendiary and just insane rhetoric that comes behind the ideals on either side of the equation, and realize what balance has to be struck between the 2 extreme models so that it can kind of flow without destroying everything. That's what we need in government. And truthfully, people, it's what we're losing in a terrible way, because idealism triggers our emotions, and our emotions run away with us, and we just end up making a lot of bad decisions. Everybody in a relationship should know that by now. Everybody who's lived life should know that by now. When you're emotional, you make bad decisions. I'm ranting, and I wanted to keep this short. Point was, the free market system, as conservative purists view it, is pretty much just as flawed a practical concept as a communist government, because resources end up being dominated by a few people who do what they do naturally. Naturally, corporations will do this. It's not because they're necessarily evil, which means I have to recant on my previous statement. I've said it many times that corporations are inherently evil. Corporations' bottom line is really profit and growth for the corporation. And the smart ones understand that means a lot of humanitarian things, and the dumber ones just drive straight for profits while ignoring everything else. But that's what they do. And so we have to work around what they do naturally and try and keep in check some of that stuff they do that harms the whole system. But not getting so ahead of ourselves that those keeping check on the corporations become their own form of completely ineffectual dominators who then wreck it up, mess up the whole system itself. There's where our balances lie. I can make several other videos because there's a lot of other things that relate to this topic, that kind of clue into them. For example, there's all kinds of things going on in our economic situation right now as far as what model is best. Should the government spend out of recession? Should the government cut out of recession? Of course, it should do both. And it takes a moderate to do that. So just vote your moderates. That's, I suppose, the end of my thing. I can get into that other stuff. Maybe never, maybe tomorrow. Alright.